All right. So now our topic is unbreakable cipher, because everybody who hears the cryptography or the encryption algorithms wants to create something unbreakable. And they always ask if it is possible to create something unbreakable. And the answer is yes. Actually, we have an algorithm called one-time pad, or sometimes called Randomness cipher. So if you use it, it is unbreakable. So before moving on to it, let me mention Kirchhoff's principle. This is very popular in cryptography. So actually, he has, I think, 4 principles, but this one is the most famous one. Cipher must not be required to be secret, and it must be able to fall into the hands of the enemy without inconvenience. So here, actually, he's saying that try not to hide the algorithm itself, only hide the secret information, which is the secret key that is used for the encryption and decryption. Okay, so in other words, the security of the system must rest entirely on the secrecy of the key. This is important because people who are not familiar with cryptography are still submitting academic papers where they don't actually have this kind of security, but they try to obtain security by hiding the steps or hiding the algorithm, which actually is referred to as secrecy by obscurity, which is not a valid approach in academics. You cannot rely on your security by assuming that the enemy doesn't know the algorithm, because this in history you can always see that it falls into the hands of the enemy. We called it 3 B's of the cryptography, called bribery, burglary, and blackmail. The enemy might get your algorithm by bribing the people. Maybe they can steal it, or they can do blackmail. Okay, and Claude Shannon actually shortens the Kirchhoff principle by simply saying that the enemy knows the system. So even if the enemy knows the system, how can I create an unbreakable cipher? So what actually Shannon proposes is as follows. We can use one-time pad, or I think Shannon showed that this is probably secure. Idea is as follows. Generate a very long sequence of random bits called one-time pad. It is called one-time pad because in practice, generally, you write these random zeros and ones in a very small letters on a single page of a notepad. So this is why it is called one-time pad, and you are going to use it only one time. So idea is as follows. You convert your plain text into bits again, and you XOR your plain text with this one-time pad to obtain the ciphertext, and you XOR the ciphertext with the one-time pad to get the plain text. So first, let's talk about what an XOR is. XOR is short for exclusive OR operation. So XOR means that it is actually a modular addition modulo 2. Okay, so it is like simple addition. Once you add 0 to 0, you get 0. If you add 0 to 1, you get 1. If you add 1 to 0, you get 1. But once you XOR 1 and 1, since it is modulo 2, you obtain 0, but you don't have a carry bit here. If you were adding in modulo 2, you would have a carry bit, but now, if you're performing normal addition, you would have a carry bit, but now you don't have the carry bit. So each bit is, added independently. That is the idea behind XOR operation. So again, 0 XOR 0 is 0. 0 XOR 1 is 1. 1 XOR 0 is 1. But 1 XOR 1 is 0. And there it doesn't affect the following or previous bits. Okay. So this is how the XOR operation is defined. So you convert your plain text into zeros and ones. You beforehand created a one-time pad consisting of random zeros and ones, and you give this information to the person you want to communicate in a secure way, preferably by physically meeting and giving this one-time pad. And in the future, when you want to send a message, you perform this operation and send the ciphertext. So that person receives the ciphertext. They also know the one-time pad. Now they also perform the XOR operation. 1 XOR 1 is 0. 1 XOR 0 is 1, and so on. So return back to the plain text. So as simple as that. So this is secure because from the ciphertext, since one-time pad is randomly chosen, you cannot guess it. So from ciphertext, guessing the plain text is identical to guessing this randomly generated one-time pad. So this is why it is provably secure. Okay. So you have to, of course, follow some rules. One-time pad must be truly random. So it has to be generated in a random way. So if you, for instance, in the past, some people do as follows. For instance, they take a book from Shakespeare, they choose a page number and say that, okay, we start from this page with the letters and, use those letters. Of course, instead of bits, you can also perform operation on some letters, but, it is easier to work on bits. And second important thing is that one-time pad can only be used once. If you want to send a second message, second plain text, you have to use a different one-time pad. Okay, this is very, very important. And it is in still modern days, we break some systems, for instance, for the ransomware that was written in Turkish, we're making this mistake again and again, okay? Sometimes it is referred to as IV reuse in practice, but the idea is that using the thing that has to be used once, but they're using it twice, okay? So we call it perfect secrecy because ciphertext provides no information about plaintext. You might say that, okay, plaintext has redundancy, but since the one-time pad does not have any redundancy, XOR operation removes that redundancy. This is why you cannot perform frequency analysis on this case. Okay. Usually printed on a single page with very small letters, hence the name one-time pad. Instead of working with bits, one can work on letters or characters. The problems are as follows. Key is too long. If you want to send 1 megabyte of plain text, you should have a 1 megabyte of one-time pad created beforehand. So think about your, WhatsApp messaging speed. You have to give that many one-time pads beforehand. So it is not that practical. And also key distribution is not practical. You have to give all of those one-time pads to that person. And the third problem is the randomness. If your random number generator is not that good, here your one-time pads will have some statistical weaknesses. And if the attacker knows that, they can use that statistical weaknesses to break the system. By randomness in this scenario, we say that every bit has a chance of being 1 or 0 with probability 1/2. Even if your random number generator, for instance, 10 ones, the 11 bits has probability 1/2 to become 1 or 0. Okay. This is what we expect from truly random. So weaknesses, I mentioned that key reuse using the same one-time pad device is a problem. Let's see why this is a problem. So assume that the adversary captures 2 ciphertexts. And again, remember that we always assume that this communication channel is unsecure. So enemy always captures every ciphertext and stores them. And actually, country is always listening to each other and storing all of those ciphertexts because with the hope that in the future they may come up with a method to break them and obtain the plain text. So assume that the adversary captured 2 ciphertexts, C1 and C2. And now they may think that maybe they use the same one-time pads. Okay. What the adversary do is as follows. They XOR C1 and C2. But if the person who encrypted them really use the same one-time pad, in this notation, it is K. So they XOR the first plain text with K to obtain C1, and they XOR the second plain text with the same key to obtain C2. So XORing C1 and C2 means P1 XOR K, XOR P2 XOR K, right? If this is the case, since XOR operation is modulo 2, having 2 Ks here means that they cancel each other. So C1 XOR C2 actually gives you P1 XOR P2. Now you might think that, okay, but the attacker captured P1 XOR P2, but this is just XOR 2 unknown messages. So what can learn the attacker from here? But recall that we mentioned that the plain text has redundancy. So P1 and P2 have the same redundancy. So for instance, if it is written in English, E letter appears the most here and also here. So when you XOR them, you have more idea about what is going to happen. So just by looking at this, in the past, people captured most parts and sometimes all of the parts of P1 and P2. Okay, so this happens in the past a lot of times. Okay. So here's an example from the Second World War. So this is called Venona project. Soviet one-time pad messages sent from the US for a brief time during World War II used non-random key material. US cryptanalysts, beginning in the late 40s, were able to entirely or partially break a few thousand messages out of several hundred thousand. Okay? The unbreakable cipher can be broken when it is not used properly. One-time pads are exchanged between Washington and Moscow in order to be used in the future if necessary. So if in the future something bad happens, like a technological advancement allows to break all of our known cipher systems, or a zombie apocalypse, I don't know, they may choose to use these one-time pads. So you might think that how they exchange this, you give it to your agents, put them in a plane, send them to Moscow, give those briefcases to the people in Moscow and come back. So they done it already. So we cannot use one-time pads in practice because it is not practical, but this idea actually leads us to the stream ciphers. Because in the one-time pad, we are using a very long random string of bits. In the stream ciphers, we are going to use short random bits, like 128 bits for our key. But from that, our aim is to generate random-looking, very long zeros and ones, which we will call pseudo-random numbers. Okay. So these are important because now, when in lectures, when you talk about block ciphers and stream ciphers, people generally cannot guess why we are using it in practice, because without the historical background, you cannot guess why we have this kind of algorithms. But so far we covered historical ciphers, which actually gives idea why we are going to use block ciphers and stream ciphers.